Thank you for joining our session today on small business lending. I'm Erin Cox. I'm Senior Program Officer here at LISC. And I know that we did introductions with everybody who was in attendance. I didn't do any introductions with any of our hosts, so I'll give them the chance to introduce themselves as they start the presentation. Joined with me today is Megan Ressler from the Rhode Island office, as well as Jay O'Grady, our lender. And then our hosts for the day, you'll get to know a little bit on as in the presentation. Many of you are really familiar with LISC due to our operation of the Child Care and Early Learning Facilities Fund. And that's where we provide technical assistance, training, and funding, most recently for grants for the improvement and development of childcare spaces. Increasingly, we are seeing providers wanting to start a new business, improve or expand their existing spaces, but sometimes they struggle with finding the necessary capital to move forward. So really today, we'd like to use this session to talk about how small business lending can be a helpful tool to think about the needs of your childcare space. We hope to introduce what it means to be financially ready to obtain a loan, to provide examples of the products that we have available, to share some case studies, and to review what to expect when seeking a loan. And then also at the end, before we open it up for Q&A, we'll share some of our Rhode Island updates around potential funding opportunities. This session will be led by LISC's National Senior Director of Childcare and Early Learning, Cindy Larson, as well as our Small Business Development Officer, David Johnson. And so with that, we look forward to a great session, and I will kick it off to you, Cindy.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I do know some of you, and it was really nice to see you during introductions, and look forward to hopefully meeting others in the coming months. So as Erin said, we have such a nice small group today that hopefully this can be more conversational than presentation. I am just going to do sort of a high-level intro to the topic, and then I will be kicking it over to David to really dig in on some of the real meat of this session. So, I wanted to start by just talking about generally, why do we even all want to be here today learning about debt? Let's face it, it is not the most exciting way to fund a program or a business. And many of you over the last couple of years have been able to engage with LISC around some of the wonderful grant programs that we've been running. And we're delighted to be able to get grants out to people. It's always one of the best ways to help with some projects and some business growth. But the reality is those dollars just aren't enough to do everything that you want and need to do. So we like to think and talk about debt as sort of a piece of a puzzle, a tool in a toolbox, just sort of a part of a kit of things that you need to put together to have your business really come together and work and be able to grow. So some of the home-based providers were talking about, sort of an exciting plan to think about what's your next stage of growth in moving from a home to a center. That's probably not going to be possible without debt being a piece of that puzzle. I shouldn't say that that's true for everyone. Sometimes we all have we win the lottery, maybe not the $2 billion, but maybe a piece of it or some other kinds of things happen. But most frequently with small business, debt is a piece of it. But we really want to sort of center on the fact that sometimes debt can be a great thing and sometimes debt is not a great thing. And it's important to really sort of understand those nuances and differences and to think about those buckets and to make sure if you are pursuing debt, it's for the right reasons and it's good debt. So the kinds of things that you would consider good debt would be if it's a one-time cost, if there's clearly a pathway to pay that back, if it allows you to get going on a project sooner than you might otherwise be able to, and if it really strengthens you long-term. Also, if the terms of the debt feel good. You want to avoid it if it's sort of that predatory kind of lending with extremely high rates and not favorable terms. You also want to think about if the debt is really just to cover those day-to-day expenses. That tends to not be good debt. There's something called working capital that helps you get a business off the ground. That's very different. But if you're running a business where the money coming in just simply doesn't cover the money going out, debt is not a great way to fill that. And that sort of seems obvious, but we wouldn't be laying that out right up front if it wasn't something that we see happening sometimes. When you're thinking about a lender, we at LISC know that childcare is a really special industry in a lot of ways. You're doing such phenomenally important work. It's a complicated business, and your cash flow is just not great. It's not a business where anybody's really getting rich, or where most people are getting very rich. So you need a lender that really understands that business and will know how to work with you to make sure that they're setting you on a really good pathway. And also that has terms that are going to make sense for your loan. So with that, let's talk a little more about what that might look like, what debt might look like. So one of the really common things that we see childcare providers use debt for is buildings, the actual sort of brick and mortar infrastructure of where you're going to run a business, either purchasing a building, renovating a building, doing something called leasehold improvement to a leased space, but something really tied to a very physical space. And again, as I was saying, that can be particularly complicated with childcare because childcare is a complicated business. There's very tight operating margins. You all know this. But also the spaces cost a lot. It's not cheap to get a childcare space that really works. And there's lots of regulations, many of them for good reasons, but that can add time and complexity. And just, in general, anytime you're adding time to a project, that adds cost. So that can make sort of figuring out the debt pieces a little trickier. So again, if you're pursuing debt, make sure you're working with a lender that really understands and is laying out a logical pathway for you. So what are some of the kind of things, and again, David's going to really dig in on this, but I just wanted to sort of set the framing of what are some of the kinds of things you should be expecting to talk about when you're pursuing debt. We're going to want to know, and you're going to want to know, that your organization and your business are ready for this, that you're financially stable enough to take on that next step of commitment. And, a financial institution, and this is something I've learned over my years in this work, the way a financial institution looks at stability may be a little bit different than the way the folks that are sort of in the business of childcare every day look at it. Financial stability for childcare is that you've been able to survive and even thrive. But when you start talking to a financial institution, there's some really specific benchmarks and definitions that they use. So it's important to understand that you just may be looking at some of this slightly differently. You also want to know that you have the infrastructure to be able to manage a project. So if you're looking to take on debt and growth, it's probably, you may need an extra person. You may need someone to cover some of what you do. So it's just important to think about that. And LISC has tools to help you with that. The other thing to know is that loans often require collateral. If you're purchasing a building, renovating a building, then that building can often serve as collateral. If there's not going to be a physical building attached to it, then it may be some of your own personal assets that need to serve as that collateral. So that's just something that's important to think about going into it. Next. And, you need to be ready to answer lots of questions. And again, that speaks to finding a lender that you can be comfortable having those conversations with. And I would encourage you to really think about, questions can be frustrating. You just want to do the project, you just want to get it done. But these questions can actually help you to make sure that you've thought about all of the pieces. So, using LISC as an example of a lender that is known for asking lots of questions. And some of you who have joined today have been through some of that process with us. We want to ask those questions to make sure that your project is going to be successful, to make sure that you can repay a loan without having any problems along the way, and that it's actually putting you in the best possible position. So just, understand that some of the kinds of things people are going to want to know about is a lot about financials. But not only about your financials looking back, there's going to be lots of questions and thinking about the financials moving forward. So using as an example, a family childcare provider moving to a center. We'll want to know about your business now, but we're going to want to do a lot of thinking about what does that look like in future years? What are the projections for that business? So if you don't have those right now, that's something that we have tools that we can help you think about. And again, try to view it as an opportunity. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, David Johnson, who's going to really dig in with you on the products and the services that LISC has. But I'll also be here hanging in the background to engage in the dialogue and hopefully help answer questions.
Thank you, Cindy. And thank you everyone for joining today. Cindy, I really liked the meat of the presentation. I'm going to make an analogy here. I've heard it described as meat and potatoes lending for a lot of the lending we do here. And as we review opportunities like this, and apologies, I've been a vegetarian at points in my life too. So the point there being very kind of straightforward in some sense. And like Cindy just mentioned, really working with you to understand and ask questions related to your operations, making sure that we're structuring from the start of the project, the potential capital stack together well in a way that makes sense to you, that the debt's manageable, that we understand kind of what that almost monthly type of operational flow is for you as a provider right now. And then really focusing on, for whatever expansion opportunity, whatever you're pursuing, all the different components related to that. So it is very, meat and potatoes are very direct with you and very relationship focused, which may be a good segue here. For the lending we do at LISC, it is very relationship focused and very mission focused. So just in general, regardless of industry, some of the things that we're really focusing on is supporting minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, LGBTQ+ and veteran-owned businesses in low to moderate income neighborhoods, and also just areas of kind of impact and relevance to our different local offices. So from a mission perspective, that's kind of what we focus on. And I think we can go to the next slide to start to talk about some of the products. So Cindy touched on permanent working capital. We'll kind of go left to right on this slide and spend a little bit of time on each. The working capital lending that we do at LISC is also very straightforward and very project focused or opportunity focused. Like she mentioned, you hopefully aren't exploring working capital as just a way to almost kind of cover back expenses or things that you're not able to already cover from your existing cash flow. Working capital can be focused on those growth opportunities. So if you are expanding to another facility and you need to hire 2 or 3 staff members, ideally some of that funding will eventually be able to be covered by your own cash flow as you grow into that facility. But maybe from the start, you need a 3 to 4 month runway to help cover that new staff members' expenses. That's the idea maybe behind a working capital loan, is covering those very specific items up until the point that you're also able to cover it with your own cash flow. Some of the other things that will come up there with working capital, marketing comes up a lot. And the same thing in mind there, that it's not just taking on a loan generally to be able to market more, and you don't really have a specific plan going in, that if you are looking to take on debt for that it also has a specific use. So maybe it's a new marketing campaign or a new program that you need to market. So you're looking to borrow some additional funds for that to help grow that program initially and get it ramped up. The other quick note there, just on the working capital point and how we are a little different than a more traditional bank. Maybe it's a bank that you already have your accounts with, or just other business banks and credit unions in the market. As you continue to grow, there might be opportunities for revolving lines of credit that can help with that working capital perspective. Same thing in mind there, that line of credit might not just be covering all of your expenses, but maybe there are some buffers as you're waiting on payments, either from the state or different programs. A revolving line of credit is something that you can kind of access and pay down and then access again as needed. So that is something, kind of a healthy form of debt that you might be able to pursue through a bank and other options. The permanent working capital lending we do at LISC is, again, a little bit more straightforward, where you are also paying it on a monthly basis. So it's a term loan with the funds dispersed up front for one of those specific things, and then you're paying it back on kind of a once a month basis. Moving over to the next section, a lot of the things that we'll talk about today are just focused on these different growth opportunities, right? So that might be acquiring your own space, leasehold improvements to a space. FF&E stands for furniture, fixtures, and equipment. So as you do expand and need to increase your equipment and furniture for that space, just kind of fully furnishing it and getting it operational, that's the idea there. The amount that you'll see, $100,000 to $500,000, is kind of the main area that we focus on in that space, especially for the leasehold improvements. So something to keep in mind there. And you also see if you go down to the $350,000 level, once it gets above that point, we're really focusing on hopefully acquiring your own space and building out your own asset versus putting a lot of investment and debt into something that you're leasing and potentially looking to move on from at some point in time. So especially at that $100,000 to $350,000 level, those loans can help fund ideally all the renovations that might be needed to that space. So if it had not previously been a daycare, but you're looking to move into, or knowing a lot of the people in the room today, or you're home-based, right? You're looking to look at a lease space. Hopefully that'll fully fund any renovations to make it a daycare, to get the furniture, fixtures, and equipment in there to make it operational. That's the idea behind kind of that size of lending. And then again, with the makerspace and commercial real estate acquisition loans, that $100,000 and going up, depending on the market and the different price points for the properties you're looking at. LISC is similar to a traditional bank and lender in the sense that we are able to explore those. So we'll also get in the details for the next slides on why a bank might not be able to approve you for an acquisition loan, let's say at the $500,000 or $700,000 level for a space. LISC is able to review those and see if we're an alternative. I think it's probably a good time to go to the next slide to start to go into some of those details. This also just gives a little bit of an overview. I'll go quick on these next couple of slides. The economic development lending that we do at LISC, this gives a quick snapshot as of the start of the year, 200 loans totaling $142 million. That can include, as you can see at the bottom, kind of larger scale projects such as community facilities and different mixed use spaces. So maybe both commercial and residential facility. And then the next slide, I think, is a little more focused, thank you, on small business lending, thinking of maybe that leasehold example, an average loan size of $427,000, focusing on the different areas we talked about. And again, the numbers there reflect 68% of our loans going to minority-owned businesses and 54% women-owned businesses. Thank you. I think a couple of case studies here and both relevant to the Rhode Island market. So LISC has been involved as a long-term funding partner for a business called Beautiful Beginnings. Some of this predates me, but the details on it go all the way back to 2007. You see the before and after photos there. That 2007 loan was very much like a large-scale project, right? It was a $1.2 million funding facility that you'll see in the phase one there that involved the entire adaptation to that commercial space to make it a daycare. So you'll see the funding stack, which again, as Cindy touched on, especially for projects of that size, ideally that is combining debt at whatever level that you're able to pay back, but also some other funding sources. So grants that are available, private funding, things that might not be tied to debt specifically, and kind of a large payment that you're having to pay back. The second phase of that project, the one you see there in 2016, was expansion to that facility. So allowing it to increase the class size and the capabilities from within the facility. So again, for maybe your home-based daycare, if you're looking to make that jump in the coming years or months into your own space, your own commercial space, but right now are home-based, maybe there's some renovations or adaptations that we can be pursuing and helping fund to increase your class size or your enhance your operations. So the idea with the second loan, again, was just enhancing the existing space.
I have to chime in on this one.
Please,
because I know that I know it's probably a familiar project to many of the folks that are here with us today, because it is a visible building and a place where we often even have community events and things. You know, this space, when LISC first met them, the program was in a fairly small and really not great rental storefront space. And moving to this building, it was a huge process, but ultimately the debt payments ended up being very similar to what the lease payments were in a really not good space, with enrollment almost doubling. And Beautiful Beginnings made their final loan payment 2 months ago and now actually owns the building outright. So it's just a really great motivational example of when debt can really be an amazing tool to really stabilize and grow a business.
Thank you for mentioning that, Cindy. And it's a great rent replacement strategies are something that we talk a lot about. So whatever your current rent payment is, let's say it is a lease space that you're at, just like you described there, Cindy, if there's an opportunity to move that to a acquiring your own space and making payments towards your own asset and building that out over time and just seeing that growth with your own facility, that is definitely a long-term goal and something that, again, we want to kind of help you strategize on. The next one, I'm a little more familiar. I had the pleasure of working recently with Eve and Tony, and some of you might be aware there too, kind of a cool backstory. Eve had worked at the Oliver Day School, a long-standing facility in the area previously, and then with her husband, Tony, have since acquired the business and are the owners now. And as of this year, we help them pursue an expansion loan for a second facility. It's also a lease space. So again, kind of in that area, the total amount of funding ended up being $420,000. And that was a combination of both tenant improvements. You can see some of the early on improvements maybe to the right. It's a little further along now. But so a combination of renovations to that space and equipment and furniture and things to get it fully funded. So that was what that total amount was. Some of the things, just the context and background there too, just as they continued to grow their operations out of the current facility as a lender, some of the initial questions we were asking are relationship-based things. Were just based on what those current operations were. Did they have a wait list, which they did? The proximity was about 15 minutes between locations. So they had already identified that some of their current students would have interest potentially in actually moving to this other space or have some flexibility there. For some of the people on the wait list, also again communicating that there was flexibility with the facilities, and this new market, even though there was kind of some of that overlap, also allowed them to expand into a slightly different area and neighborhood. So as you're pursuing expansion, let's again either if it's going from home daycare to a leased or acquisition space, or maybe a second facility, those are some of the things that as a relationship-based lender, we're trying to understand, making sure that demand is not just there, but also documented. That can be something as it goes through a loan underwriting process too, that things like having that wait list or any letters of interest. As you can see from the pictures, have kids myself. I know it's hard for daycares. Families are making decisions very live time, but anything that's really communicating and showing that demand and your operations outside of just the cash flow that we'll go into is very helpful. And then the last thing I'll say here that we'll talk more about, just Eve and Tony did a great job, and it's something that we really try and work with borrowers on, is a very hands-on relationship, not just with you, but also with the contractors. So for those renovations that you see, that's a relationship in itself. And maybe that's your first time as you're looking at expanding, going into that area. So it's something that LISC has done a lot of. We have local resources, and it's something that just we try and be very intentional in making sure they're sticking to budget, making sure that as a lender, we're supporting you and that our loan size is related to their initial estimates and budget. So that is a very hands-on process that we try to help support as well. So some more things just in terms of expectations going into all this, which hopefully the overwhelming theme from all this from a relationship standpoint is we want to work with you on this. We know too that lending can seem or feel overwhelming, especially if it's your first time going through that process. So, and it can also feel very personal. So we're the first item, personal tax returns, just giving that up in the first place, or starting to look and talk about credit. It's a very personal thing. And so we want to walk with you through that process. We don't have an online application. It's not something where we're doing like a hard credit pull from the start. A lot of what we do in this list here is just working with you, doing an initial cash flow, making sure we understand your operations, your idea for what expansion could look like, and giving you some realistic feedback on, is this something that looks like you could take on right away at this level, or is this something that we need to maybe kind of develop a little bit more of a long-term plan on? So these items that you'll see here, the 3 years of personal and business tax returns, allow us to do pretty much from the start a very core cash flow review. So that is looking at your personal taxes to try to account for any other forms of income. So in addition to the daycare, if you have any other like rental properties or side forms of income, anything else that we should be counting in, and then your business taxes. So, and the reason again behind that personally, just knowing how tied in you are to your business, we want to make sure that our loan payment too, even though it is a business loan, is something that fits into kind of your global cash flow and your household income as well. So the business taxes, again, looking at the 3 year, those to understand that side specific to just the business. What have your expenses been? Are there a lot of changes over the last 3 years? So maybe you're already expanding, maybe you're already increasing your salaries and wages. Just understanding kind of the trajectory of all that going into this current review is what we're trying to do from the start. Interim financial statements, maybe a key point there too. That can be something, if you're not already working with a bookkeeper and or an accountant, it can be really helpful, especially as you're looking at taking on further financing and debt. There are great tools out there, things like QuickBooks, that can hopefully enhance just you as a business owner being able to pull up a quick report and try to understand some of these things. But it can also be really helpful to work with somebody that is going to be able to prepare a full profit and loss, a full balance sheet that shows as of whatever point in time you're looking for funding, just what the operations have been that year in detail. So that is a key statement that we look at, and just a point of advice we give to build out your team of support that maybe, if you're not already doing that, can be helpful. Personal financial statements allow us to understand just how much cash you have on hand going into the project, what your debts are before we pull credit, things of that nature. Business debt schedules, all things we have templates for, again, by the way, too, and try to work hands-on with you on. Maybe you do have that line of credit through a bank, so just understanding what that is, or credit cards, any other areas that you've had to self-fund to this point, just to make sure that we understand what other debt is going in is really helpful. And then some other things like your articles, and working with you on W-9s to make sure we kind of fully document your lease. So a quick point there before we go to the next slide, just if it is leasehold improvements, we usually match our terms to whatever the lease terms are. So if you're going into a 5-year lease, we want to understand what that agreement is. And ideally, we would just do a loan that covers the length of that lease. Maybe there are options where you can extend the lease, and we could also look to extend out past that term. But that way you're not paying loan funds for 15 or 20 years when you're looking to move out of that facility, ideally within 5 to 7. That's kind of the idea with that. And then the last point before we move on, again, the contracts, the quotes for your leasehold improvements, everything else on this list is really focused on making sure we understand your operations as an operator. Then it's almost two-pronged, where we're working with you to support that second phase, very specific to the construction, the renovations. Maybe it's just equipment, making sure that we understand what vendor you're working with and the quotes for the specific equipment, and not just saying, I think I need $100,000 maybe for equipment. Like making sure that is sized at the right level too, is why we get very hands-on in supporting you on that. Thank you, because the personal guarantee will come up here too. So now might be a good time. I know we're holding Q&A to the end, but just to take a deep breath, there's charts coming up and full. We really do want to go through some of these things almost line by line, just to give at least a general overview going into the Q&A, and also goes without saying, but after this going forward, I myself can be a direct point of contact in addition to everyone else on the team to really work through all these. But today, hopefully it's just laying it out. So some of the things that we look at for LISC to see if we're the right fit as a small business lender, right, for some of these projects. One, just being in operation for at least 2 years. So we don't do anything really in the startup space. And apologies not knowing this for everyone in the room has, as long as you've been operating for at least 2 years, and maybe that is out of your home-based center, that doesn't mean you have to be like out of a very specific commercial space for 2 years. Maybe you've been operating for 2 to 3 out of your home and are now looking for that commercial space. That absolutely qualifies, as long as some of these other things are also kind of in line with supporting that type of expansion. But what we don't do, again, is like pre-revenue based businesses that are just starting out. There are other lending partners, other non-bank partners too, that maybe focus on more microloan scenarios that help you with initial licensing costs, or maybe small equipment needs below the $100,000 level too. So that's the other thing, is both minimum annual business revenue of $100,000, but also the loan size, as we covered a little bit on previous slides. The lending we do is also usually at $100,000 and above. And it's usually that you've been there from a revenue perspective as well. And you're not looking to take on $100,000 or $200,000 loan when you're still at the $20,000 to $30,000 revenue size annually, and maybe just starting out with a couple of kids and looking to expand. So those are kind of some initial benchmarks for us. The global debt service will do some follow-up too, with like definitions and terms. The idea when you see things like this from a lender, 1.2, to use a really straightforward example, essentially that's saying that you ideally have $1.20 coming in if you have $1 worth of expenses, knowing that's obviously multiplied much larger on a monthly basis, but that's kind of the straightforward example there. Again, is just making sure that you have more revenue coming in than expenses going out, which, as Cindy mentioned, some of that might sound straightforward, but a lot of that is done after kind of taking a step back and doing a review, and that can be off your tax returns and also just interim statements again for the year. But sometimes you're not even aware that as you're adding on some of these things and salaries, whatever it is, that sometimes that the expense number has caught up, if not expanded, to the current revenue you have coming in. So even though we are different than a bank at LISC and try to be flexible in a few different ways, the cash flow part of it, we do want to make sure we understand, and again, make sure it's a responsible time to add on debt. Equity is something that you'll see come up a lot too. So the 10% number there is really focused on acquisition of spaces or leasehold improvements. So let's use $100,000 as an example again. Let's say you're doing $100,000 worth of improvements to a lease space. Ideally, you're bringing in $10,000 is the idea there. Have that as cash on hand, and maybe you've already started to put forward expenses that we can count as that equity. Maybe that's paying for initial drawings with the architect to understand the improvements that are going to be made, or initial equipment investments. It's ideally showing the lender that you are making some kind of investment, that 10% level. And there are cases where we can go smaller as well if the cash part of it is kind of a limiting factor for you. More traditional banks traditionally are going to want to see larger levels of investment and equity, especially too when it comes to acquisitions. Maybe it's like that $1.2 million facility. We'll use $1 million as an example. Sometimes banks want to see 20 or 30% equity or cash on hand. So $200,000 or $300,000 in that example for how much you'd be putting into the project. So that is a very specific area where LISC tries to be more flexible, understanding that that can be a barrier, a systemic barrier. It's something that we want to address and make sure you have enough cash to be able to cover things, and if construction runs over, but not have a high equity requirement. That's the idea there. Again, all stuff we can follow up much more on too. Credit is another very specific area. So you see the 600 to 650. This might sound either confusing or something that just, even after an explanation, doesn't make total sense. Even though these are business loans, banks, lenders of any kind, LISC 2 is looking at personal credit, and the personal credit score, especially at more traditional lenders and banks, can sometimes have to be a very specific number. Part of that is because of the way banks are regulated and different lending laws, but sometimes that number has to be 720 or 750. Some of that'll vary a little bit bank to bank, but certainly into the 700s. And if your personal credit is not at that level, then business loans really might not be on the table at the different levels either. So we also have a range. 6 to 650 is kind of that range we look at. There have been scenarios that we have lent to small business owners who have personal credit scores below that level too. And that might be something where there's a bankruptcy in the past that is really affecting that number still, but we are comfortable with the fact of where you are now kind of coming out of that. So just high level too, that's really, as a relationship lender, something that we focus on from the start is understanding the backstory on bankruptcies, collections, tax liens, anything that might be affecting your credit score, just to make sure that we understand that past and where you are now and making sure it's a good time to take on debt. That is how we look at credit most initially versus it being very score-based. Clear, just to throw that out there now too, it's a number that we use for background checks and reports. So the different range items there are very specific to that specific report that we run. The idea there, again, is the exact same thing. That's going to flag things like past tax liens. It also is going to flag things like arrest records. And we do a lot of lending in the space of reentry citizens and things that, especially if a bank is going through an SBA loan process, not to throw additional terms and processes on there, but that can be very specific in the types of lending they're able to do and how much time has to have passed since anything has come up. So that is here to say that we do, again, very similar searches and checks and want to understand the story. So another last takeaway there maybe is just to hopefully that's a very honest conversation with you where you don't feel like you have to hide anything, that we are going to be doing those checks and searches and just want to make sure that we understand the story. So something to be forthcoming and hopefully talk through is really the takeaway. One other key item, maybe credit enhancement, is just give the quick explanation there. LISC is a nonprofit again too. So credit enhancement for us, it can also relate to subsidized funding sources that we receive that we use to blend down interest rates. We'll talk more about interest rate too, but that just is covering that portion of it, that sometimes we receive certain enhancement sources that allow us to blend down that rate even further. Again, especially supporting women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, programs like that. The legal organization part, it is important to note that you do have to be registered as a business entity, so as an LLC or whatever the structure is, but we're not able to lend to sole proprietors. One thing that might come up, especially with the home-based scenario, if you are a single member LLC, that is something, as long as you are organized in that way, it still might be appearing on your personal taxes as a Schedule C operator. But if you're a single member LLC designated as a business entity, that can still be an area that we're able to immediately lend to. And the other takeaway there is maybe you're not already set up in that way, but as you're exploring financing and exploring expansion, that can be something that we talk with you about to see if there's ways that you should explore changing that legal organization. And then principal owners must be U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents. Just a quick takeaway too, not to open up the entire box. We have done some loans in the past, like ITIN lending with identification numbers in areas where we do try to be flexible there as well. So that's something I think definitely would be best to leave that as a takeaway item. But if there are any specific scenarios that come up, happy to start that conversation from the start and make sure that we could try and support. But it can be an area of flexibility versus a more traditional lender with that too. And then geographic location we touched on a little bit. Ideally, we're supporting loans in priority communities for LISC or in low to moderate income neighborhoods as a way of continued development and supporting business owners in that way. Thank you. I'll try and go a little, I don't know if there's time, maybe quickly on the last one. I'll be very quick here. So some of these different credit items, we really covered a lot of them. So things like foreclosures or tax liens, I would actually describe it as a little bit more flexible even on this slide, really understanding how much time has passed. If there's proof of payments, that's kind of the main thing to keep in mind with really any credit related item. So thank you. That's probably fine to go on to the next. Some quick conditions for decline, or maybe a better way to put that again is also understanding, like maybe it's not now, but in 12 months, we think you'll be in a better position to take on debt. Startup business, again, at least 2 years in operation, insufficient cash flow, if both historically and also projections are a takeaway item really quick here too, is we will work with you on projections as well. So it's the cash flow of what you've been doing historically, but also making sure we understand if you increase your class size by X, by 10 students, all the positive impact that that's going to bring on for a revenue projection is what we want to understand. And then especially with daycares, Cindy and everyone have really educated me that can be an industry more so than other ones, even where that revenue growth is really growing at a higher level than your expenses. Maybe you're going to increase some expenses. Maybe it is staffing or whatever else, but making sure we understand that cash flow and how positive that expansion is going to be to that, and that our loan payment is going to be factoring into that kind of more future-facing repayment is something that we want to understand too. So insufficient cash flow is a combination of just making sure we understand both historical and projected cash flow. And then some other quick reasons for decline, especially if there are things like no payment on child support or no payment on tax liens without follow-up, without either already having engaged or wanting to engage in a payment plan and resolution can be areas where we're not comfortable with adding on debt. Equity, we talked about a little bit. Maybe there's just no cash on hand to be able to go into a project, especially if it runs over. We do want to make sure there's at least some kind of base. So things like that can be reasons to decline or not move forward with the situation right away. I think that's probably good on that one, other than some of the things that we'll continue to cover. So these are the last charts. Again, deep breath maybe, but for some of these different areas, we wanted to break it out based on the types of loans. And I'll try to keep this to some key takeaways for each. But for permanent working capital, like we talked about with working capital, again, ideally that's kind of in line with where you are right now with any of these things. But with working capital, it's not a grant for what we're talking about. So we don't want to get in a situation where we're advocating for taking on $100,000 worth of working capital debt when you're currently at $100,000 of revenue. So maybe you're at those kind of minimum thresholds, but one factor that we look at actually for working capital sometimes is looking at around 15% of sales from the previous year for a general kind of working capital sizer. And banks and more traditional lenders will likely do something like that too, especially for a revolving line of credit for working capital. They're going to kind of size that appropriately based off of your revenues. And we would want to do the same with our working capital lending. So that maybe is the most important takeaway there. And again, making it very specific for the use of funds. For the leasehold improvements and the furniture, fixtures, and equipment that we talked about, again, kind of similar thresholds. You'll see the 10% there that we already touched on, making sure that there is some kind of equity contribution going into it, but that we are ideally going to be funding the remainder of the balance with the loan is the idea there. And then the debt service coverage, same thing with the 1.2 that we talked about, making sure that for those improvements for that type of debt, that you do have the cash flow to support. That number is factoring in whatever our loan payment would be. So that is saying that 1.2 number also includes whatever loan size and correlating loan payment we're adding on. I think okay to probably go to the next slide then with that too. And again, makerspace and acquisition loans, a little bit of change in how we're looking at that number, and maybe given on the loan size that there might be a slight change for that debt service coverage ratio, where still more revenue than expenses is the key takeaway there. Equity of 10% is still kind of the key item. And apologies, some of these definitions will also include different types of projects that LISC might be taking on, and more mixed use types of spaces versus some of the meat and potatoes are more straightforward things that might apply here for looking to expand to your own facility. But again, yeah, key takeaways are for things like equity that are very specific numbers for a bank. or personal credit score. Those are areas that we are still looking at them. These are the thresholds that we try to hit, but they're areas of flexibility that we try to meet you with where you're at on them too. I think that's probably good for that one too. Thank you again so much. I think we're maybe passing over. Just going forward, really looking forward to learning more about your individual situations. That's the last key takeaway, is that all of this is specific to you and meeting you where you're at. So happy to engage and talk about all these things specific to whatever you're considering.
Thank you so much, David. I always have appreciated the way that you've described your work with any of the providers that have reached out to you as, being a relationship lender, because I think it is so important to spend that individual time to understand the individual goals of each of our providers. What I can say from a Rhode Island perspective is that one of the main facets of the work that we do at the Child Care Facility Fund is to provide technical assistance. So our goal really is to work long-term and intensively with groups, maybe even for years before they're even ready to get to a conversation about lending, to ensure that we're looking at not just creating high quality access to care for children, but that we're supporting our small business in the state as well. So definitely appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah.
So with that, I'll talk a little bit about some of the funding opportunities, because, you kind of talked about equity injection a little bit as part of like a lending add-on or a need to bring to a lending deal. And, some of the things that we often have is, grant opportunities that can, again, be part of that toolbox when you're thinking about making some long-term expansion or improvements. So just want to go over what we have in Rhode Island at the moment with our planning and capital grant opportunities. So, we have two types of grants that we typically offer in Rhode Island, and a lot of it is dependent on funding sources that come into either into the state or through the Department of Human Services as well for what we have available. But, currently we have some early feasibility planning grants, and that really allows people to hire and secure professionals to plan for that space, to do feasibility studies, indoor and outdoor improvement projects through the design perspective, with architectural services, landscape or playground services, engineering studies, and environmental surveys. And that is typically something that we would be working on with you well before you'd be looking to potentially take out a loan, just to see what is feasible, what can I do, what does space look like, and what is the cost impact of doing that type of project. Currently, we have a number of different sources for that. We do have our standard LISC planning grants. So we have a very small competitive pool of funds that are available for that purpose. But in addition to that, there are two other sources. The first is the Preschool Development Grant. It's a federally funded planning grant that is a competitive application for providers that show demonstrated commitment to providing early childhood care and education for our low-income families with subsidy. You are required to have a DUNS number or an EIN number now and an active SAM.gov registration, but there are funds available for that. So if you were ever looking potentially to acquire architectural services, to reach out to us and we can see if there are any opportunities available with that grant program for you. In addition, if anyone heard the announcement, I think 2 weeks ago at this point, the City of Providence has released an announcement of their Early Childhood Care and Infrastructure Support Program, which is a competitive application for Providence-based providers. So if you're in the City of Providence, there is a dedicated pool of city sources to be able to hire an architect. And then we'll actually talk about that in the next type of grant, because it also includes capital improvement grants. So we have planning grants that are available at times. Then we also have capital improvement grants, which allows you to utilize funds for renovations to address licensing compliance, health and safety, physical space barriers for quality improvement, and even expansion of programming. And so we have two sources that are going to be available for that are not currently available at the moment, but should be forthcoming. The first is the City of Providence Early Learning Infrastructure Support Program. So there's planning dollars for that, as well as dollars associated for Providence-based providers to make those physical improvements. We anticipate that that will be opening in early 2023. If you notice in the chat, Megan is dropping some links to where all of this information is located as well. And then I'm sure everyone at this point has heard all about the bond, but we have our Early Childhood Care and Education Capital Fund. It's a competitive two-step application where you submit a letter of intent. And if that letter of intent is elected to move forward, then there will be a detailed application that follows. We currently have wave 2 open, so wave 1 just closed. And wave 2 will be open where letters of intent will be due March 24th of 2023. And the intent of that is so that there's a long period of time for you to be thoughtfully planning your potential project. This is going to be utilized for large scale expansion only. So it's not for your small health and safety improvements, but this particular grant is going to be solely for the expansion of seats in your center or at a new space. Applications for that. So if you go through the letter of intent process and get moved forward to the application, that will be due by April 21st of 2023. And then, through the Rhode Island office, we have, a dedicated lender here in our office as well. Of course, anytime that you have any questions or concerns, you can feel free to reach out. We will discuss kind of your goals of what you'd like to see with your space. And then, we can get you coordinated to the right lender, to the right person, to the right product. We do have in our office a very, very competitive pool of recoverable grants. Those are funds that are available to organizations that are looking to expand quality childcare, and those range from like $10,000 to $100,000, and they support pre-development costs like an architect and environmental engineering, legal review, project management fees. But it operates almost as a zero interest loan, and it's really competitive. So if that's something that would ever be of interest, we have a particular source that you could then reach out to for that. And then again, we also, in addition to our small business loans, we have other types of loans as well. And I think Megan also put kind of our lenders information in the chat as well. And, again, we want to start as early with you in this process as possible. So we have a series of resources that we do often give to people in advance of, going through the process of filling out all of the paperwork and sending all of the information to David to take a look at any small business lending opportunities. So we have a series of resources that we have available. So the first of which I believe is our online workshops. So we have a series of dedicated self-paced courses on the website that you see noted below. They are registered with the Center for Early Learning Professionals. So we have childcare safety, developing and financing a childcare center, creating quality school-age spaces, and we are just finishing up and we'll be launching soon the childcare design. So a childcare design course. So these are some online courses. They're great for initial understanding of what it might take to develop a center or to build out a healthy space. We recommend people go through this on their own and then reach out to us with questions if something piqued interest. In addition to that, on our website, we have nationally published resource guides. It's a series of 4 guides with some supplemental guides as well. That is, really intended for groups to look at the totality of operating and owning a childcare center, starting with our facilities development guide. It's the same one that we actually have modified that's in our online course, so that there's a variety of ways for you to take in this information. Inside the facilities development and financing course, there's also a lot of information around how to determine if you're ready to take on a project, what kind of team do you need to build to take on a project, how to assess a site if it's appropriate for childcare, and what things you should get in place to start that part of your business. In addition to that, we have our childcare design guide, and we have our equipment and furnishings guide, as well as outdoor play space guides. And then we also have, the next slide is our facilities self-assessments. So often we have created a series of self-paced, self-directed, self-questioned checklists that people can take and walk through their space. They're meant to be answered as a true or false response so that you can start to develop a master plan for improvement for your space. And yeah, just you can follow us on Twitter at LISC_. We often will share our e-news. If you haven't signed up for our e-news, we will reshare it there. And then we will also make any announcements on any funding opportunities that may become available in that way. And I think with that, that will bring us to our Q&A portion. So I think we can probably take down the presentation and open it up to the floor for anybody who may have questions.